Hello, guys. Today we have Alicia from The Healthy Hiker back on the show, and she shares some fantastic information around internal training load for hikers. Now, if you haven't heard of internal training load before, basically it's how sleep, stress, emotions, and a whole bunch of other sort of intangible factors affect your training performance and potentially your risk of injury. And this is incredibly relevant for any hikers right now, as the world is a pretty stressful place. So get yourself ready. It's a fantastic episode, and I hope you learn a lot. Hey, my name is Rowan Smith, and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast, which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare, and conquer your upcoming hike, trek, or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude, and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable, and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for. Let's get into today's episode. All right, so welcome, Alicia. Welcome back to the show. So great to have you back on.
Thank you. I'm so happy to speak with you again. It's a great honor to be back and talk to you and your listeners.
Yeah, really, really excited because the last podcast that we did, which we were talking about before on the show, that was back last year sometime, which is crazy to think about, but it got a lot of great response from a lot of listeners. A lot of people resonated with what we were talking about, so it'll be fantastic to have you on again. And the subject that we got lined up around, well, which we'll get into a minute, is actually a super interesting subject for hikers, and particularly in this time in the world where things are a bit stressful and things are a bit crazy, and it's hopefully will be really, really valuable. So to start off with, for just anyone who hasn't actually listened to the previous one we did together, do you mind just introducing yourself, just say where you are in the world, what you do, and what you do for hikers?
Sure. Well, I am the founder of the Healthy Hiker program, and I train hikers much the same way you do. I'm based in Houston, Texas, and also in Utah in the United States. And my background is in physical therapy. I've been a physical therapist for over 30 years. It really pains me to say that, but a long time. And I've done a lot of jobs in that career, but most recently I have been in sports injury and sports performance. So kind of ties in with hikers. I view hikers as athletes. I think a lot of times hikers think of themselves as recreational hobbyists. And while hiking can be recreational, I think hikers really are athletes, and they can use some of those same training principles to approach their training goals.
Yeah, fantastic. And I know today's subject, which pretty much directly relates to that, because it's something that's talked about quite a bit in the athletic population. It's something that's monitored and has a lot of focus put into it. But, in the hiking world, I don't think anyone's really ever explored it in depth, to my knowledge. So do you want to just give the listeners an introduction to what we're actually talking about today, and, what training load is and what determines training outcomes?
Sure. So looking at training outcomes, and that's very simplified. That's just your training goals. Like, what is your desired goal? What is your outcome? Do you want to become stronger, fitter, faster, leaner, hike better, tolerate different situations better? Just whatever your desired goal is, really, that's the training outcome that you're after. And so you design your program to achieve those training outcomes. And we pay a lot of attention to the external load in that program. So the external load is the actual physical work that you're doing. It's really what you can measure. It's the amount of weight that you move, the distance that you travel, the time that you do it in. Everyone's trying to either beat their time or get faster, get better, get more efficient at doing all of this physical work, right? So that's your external load. But what you alluded to, and what is not often spoken about outside of the sports science circles, is internal load. And internal load is a little harder to define. It's the thing that weighs down your body and makes it more difficult to handle the external load. And if you've ever had a day where you've gone out for a training hike or a weight training session, and it's just wonderful, and you feel like you could fly and you could do this forever, and it's just fabulous. And then the next training session where you're doing about the same external load, it just feels like rubbish. Like your legs are made of lead. You can't pick up any weights, or you just get tired so easily. The same external load, different training response, may be because your internal load is different. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is like, what is internal load? How does it show up in your training? How do you measure it? And then what you can do about it.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's dive into a little bit more about the internal load. So, if you were going to get a bit more specific, like, what is it actually, and what causes it to go up or go down, and how does that play into where we are now at this time in the world?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that can contribute to your internal load. Your internal load is your training response kind of to your external load. And so things that contribute to internal load are like weather or the environment. So we're talking about things like heat stress. If you ever, I live in the Gulf Coast, which can be very hot and humid in the summer. I can run, the same 6 miles, the same 6-mile daily route that I do in the winter. I can run it in the summer, and I can't run it as fast. My heart rate is more elevated than it is in the wintertime because of that heat load, right? That heat stress. Same thing with altitude. So if you notice that you can do a 6-mile hike at sea level and you're just great, and then you take a drive up to the mountains and you're just huffing and puffing and your heart is racing. Same thing. It's a different internal load. Sleep affects internal load. Is your body well rested? Is it able to recover? Your mental health, your emotions, your mood, those can affect your internal load, right? So say you've just gotten some bad news at work, and then you go for your workout after work, and your heart's not in it. It's difficult to execute, and you don't train as well, right? So that, again, contributes to internal load. Your perception of fatigue, like how tired you are or how hard you feel the workout is. Your age can contribute to your internal load. So as we age, and we talked about this last time on the podcast, as we age, it gets a little bit harder to do the same external loads. Your body composition, if you have a high BMI or overweight, sometimes you're dealing with extra difficulties or challenges that can add to your internal load. And then your nutrition, are you feeding your body well enough so that it can repair itself from the external load? I mean, there's just a whole list. I mean, another big one is hydration status. And so, but not just dehydration, but also overhydration. And I don't know what you find with the people that you work with, Rowan, but dehydration, I think, is really overemphasized. You can live for 3 days without water. So the chances that you're going to be dehydrated from a training hike are pretty slim. And if you're thirsty, you're going to drink, right? That's going to trigger your desire to drink. But sometimes people get on this hydrating schedule and they can overhydrate their body and have the same symptoms as when you are dehydrated. So that can be a problem. So is your body dealing with a heavier internal load because it's got all this excess fluid that it doesn't need, and now it's trying to deal with that? Another thing that contributes to internal load is general health. And what's really fascinating is if you're coming down with something, or if you're recovering from an illness, it's harder, right? Like, gosh, my workout today, my run was really sloggy, or I just didn't feel so great on the hike. My training hike today, the pack seems so heavy. Maybe I'm coming down with something, like, that feeling like maybe something's not quite right. That's your internal load that's different. And there's a study going on right now in the U.S. looking at wearable data, from wearable tracking devices. And they're looking to see if they can spot who may be coming down with COVID before they start feeling sick, because they're tracking their heart rate and their performance data. And when they start seeing some outliers, some training episodes that aren't right there in the cluster of what this person normally is, and they think, something going on there, something going on internally that's affecting their training response. Stress is another one. And this is really why I've been paying a lot closer attention to internal load of late. Because I want your listeners to ask themselves if they, with all the stressors in the world right now, are they possibly suffering from anxiety or insomnia, difficulty sleeping, overeating to deal with stress, losing their appetite, any other signs that they might be stressed from just the tumultuous times that we're living in? There's economic turndown. Some people, that's a stressor for some people. It's a fear of COVID and the frustrations about maybe your community's response. That's a stressor. And the stressors of systemic racism. Gosh, there's just so many right now. If you're not feeling a little stressed right now, maybe somebody ought to take your pulse, because there's just a lot going on. Right. So I read a recent article titled "The World is Heavy." And it's important that we recognize that, and that we know that it affects your overall training load and ultimately your desired training outcomes. So that's the important thing, is really just to recognize that all of these things are going on inside your body. So if you're getting frustrated with your exercise response, maybe it's not the things that you can see. Like maybe it's some of the things that you really can't see that you need to pay attention to.
And then what are the consequences of a high internal training load? Say someone was doing the usual training they were doing, but they were super stressed, they weren't sleeping very well, the nutrition had gone out the window, so their internal training load's relatively high. Is that just going to play out in their performance and like how well they actually do exercise, or are there going to be other consequences alongside that?
There are going to be definitely performance consequences, but if you maintain that high internal load and you continue to try to add on a high external load, what you may do is set yourself up for injury. And that's where the real caution needs to come in, because your body may not be ready to handle the stressors of the additional external load, right? So all of our tissues have a certain capacity of load that they're able to handle. And to handle those loads, they need nutrition, they need sleep. And by tissues, I'm talking about muscles, tendons, ligaments, just your overall body wellness. And if you're not giving it those things, then they're operating at a deficit. And then you add on a heavy external load and you've set yourself up for injury. Yeah.
And I think a really great example of this is way back in the early stages of the podcast when I interviewed Mark, who's another physio over our way in the world. And he was talking about people trying to reduce pack load to reduce their chance of injury or pain on the trail. And he was saying sometimes it's not so much about the pack load, that external load of what you're doing, but if you're sacrificing your sleep systems, if you're sacrificing how much water you're bringing, if you're sacrificing how much food you're bringing, you're sacrificing how warm weather clothing just for that pack weight, that's going to affect you in other ways, which can play up as potential injury risk. And I think that's a really prime example of just how important these sort of internal loads go.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. It is better to have the extra grams in the better sleeping bag where you're going to be warm at night, or the better sleeping mat where you're going to be comfortable and get good rest on the trail. Those grams, those ounces are important, and you're going to be able to handle those much better if you bring them and pay attention to the intangibles like a good night's sleep.
Yeah. And then now hopefully people listening have sort of gotten a good insight into just how important this type of knowing about this internal training load is. How could they recognize where their training load is? Because it's obviously, as you said, it's a bit intangible, it's a bit tricky. How can they recognize this?
Well, it requires monitoring, and we monitor everything with the tracking devices that we wear, and so you can monitor again your external load really well. Well, it requires that you be intentional and use the same kind of monitoring for your internal load. So there's two things that you can monitor. One of them is objective, and that's your heart rate response. Your heart rate response to exercise. So that, for instance, on a really hot day, your heart rate might be quite elevated. So you want to dial back your external load and train within an acceptable heart rate zone, right? So if I'm training for Grand Canyon right now, and so if I am training in Houston and it's 100 degrees with 80% humidity, my heart rate is going to be quite elevated. So I'm going to lessen my load in my pack while I train. And that's important so that you can stay in that heart rate training zone. But the other important aspect of heart rate response is you want to look at recovery. So how long does it take for your heart rate to recover to its resting rate after you stop exercising? And that's really just as simple as, especially if you're wearing trackable data, just looking at it and saying, okay, I've stopped working out. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to time myself for a minute or two and see how long it takes for our heart rate to go down. If you notice that it's going 5 minutes and your heart rate isn't going down, and it usually takes 2 minutes, then that might be an indicator that something is going on in your internal load that's stressing your body and requiring your heart rate to be elevated. So that's the objective measurement. Now, the subjective measurement, there's several of those. One of the big ones that most people may be familiar with is called the rate of perceived exertion, or the RPE. And that's really a measurement of how hard was your workout. So you need to keep track of your RPE to see if you notice trends. If a workout was hard and it wasn't supposed to be hard, then you might have an increased internal load that you need to go back to some of those factors that we talked about that influence internal load and see what you might need to tweak, right? So if someone is on one of your training programs and they're on an easy day, but it seems really hard, then perhaps something else is going on for them. And then if your heart rate is stable during your exercise, but you feel like it was very, very difficult, like, gosh, that felt like a really hard training exercise, but your heart rate stayed normal, then it's likely that you have a mental fatigue that's driving your internal load rather than a physical fatigue. Another way to monitor your internal load is soreness. So what body part is sore and how long does it last? Typical delayed onset muscle soreness should last 2-3 days at the most. But if you find that your legs are just, man, my calves just are killing me, and it's been a week and they're still really sore, then you need to look at what's going on with your training load. Perhaps you're not getting enough sleep. Perhaps you need to do some like foam rolling or another recovery technique to help your muscles recover. Measuring your sleep, monitoring your sleep, how much sleep you're getting, monitoring your nutrition, your hydration, your mood, and your stress level. Those are all ways to gauge your internal load.
Yeah, fantastic. And there's definitely all of those points are so relevant for anyone training for an adventure. And I know previously I've listened to a couple of presentations about this subject, and there's been a few people who recommend using certain apps or programs to sort of take all of that stuff and condense it into one. Do you ever do anything like that, or is it more of a pen and paper stuff?
Well, I've actually, there are some apps, and there are, a lot of them are geared towards the sports scientists or coaches. And so I actually have something that I've developed for your readers. And so, I mean, your readers, your listeners. And yeah, I was going to talk about it at the end, but it's a little tool that I've developed just for them, that's going to help them with some of this tracking.
Okay, all right. Well, let's talk about it at the end, because I'm actually very excited, because I've been trying to find something like that that's relevant for my hikers that isn't way too complicated. So I'm excited about that. Everyone listening, you've got to stay to the end now. So we'll see how we go. So if someone does identify that their training load is high, where they've gone through some of those measures and they're like, look, something's not quite right, and it's not down to my training, but it's like obviously something else is going on internally, what should they be doing?
The first thing to do is to recognize that your internal load is high. I mean, it's important to just be aware and then acknowledge that you're feeling stress or lacking sleep or whatever the issue might be. Sometimes just acknowledging that helps to release the load. And then the next thing is to show yourself some TLC and address those issues. And that might mean dialing back your training or taking a couple of days of rest. to get your internal load in order. And I like to advise people to change the mindset about rest days, because oftentimes people think of rest days as passive and they're a little disappointed because they're not actually doing anything. But actually, what you're doing on a rest day is you're recovering and you're addressing the internal load. And if you can decrease your internal load through those recovery days, then you can enhance the way your body is going to handle the external load when you get back to training. So ultimately, it's a real positive thing to affect your training outcomes. And sometimes that mindset shift helps people understand and adhere to those rest days or recovery workout days. Other things, again, just addressing those same issues, looking at your nutrition, making sure you're getting good nutrition. Perhaps you need to perform some meditation to help with stress. If heat or environmental stress is part of your problem, perhaps you can exercise indoors where it's a more controlled temperature environment. And again, make sure you're getting good sleep, or just address whatever the factor might be that may be adding to your internal load.
Yeah, and those areas are all so important, and it's something that I really try to put a bit of emphasis into, particularly my coaching, because I know, everyone lives lives that are super busy, that have a lot of stress going up. There's things that come up in life which you just have no control about. And one of my big pet peeves around the hiking and trekking, particularly the training industry for this, is there's a lot of people selling these very set in stone programs, and you buy it, you pay $100 and you get 12 weeks of training or something like that. But they never account for the fact that in certain situations, this internal load is going to go way skyrocket up. And, you can't expect to do a solid training session when things in your life are blowing up and not going so well. So I feel like half the battle for a successful training program is addressing things like sleep or stress, or helping your nutrition, or making sure your hydration's right, and all these things you've been talking about in the internal load. I feel like they play into such an underestimated and underutilized area for training, but it's so important for hikers in any way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. And I know that you really emphasize with your clients about being efficient and being intentional with the exercises that they're going to do. And a lot of times, as you said, workouts, you're just pounding out reps. And if your internal load is already high and you're trying to pound out reps, then you're not going to get a real positive training outcome. But as you say, if you can address those internal load issues, and let's say you take even 2 or 3 days recovery days in your week, but then you have 3 or 4 really intentional and really efficient workout days, your training outcomes are going to be so much better. You're going to feel better than the guy who's just pounding out reps in the gym. You're going to get farther with less if you pay attention to both the internal and the external loads, and you're intentional about all of it.
Exactly. One of my recent favorite workouts that I've been doing for this specific thing, and this is probably pretty relevant for anyone who loves just to train every single day and they feel really bad about having a day off, is I've been started programming things called like mindful walks, in which it's still classified as training because you're still walking for about 30-40 minutes. But I just ask someone to just go to a local park or on the beach around the neighborhood and try to spend 5 minutes at a time just focusing on one sense. So focus on your breathing. Not your breathing. Focus on what you smell. Focus on what you see. Focus on how the wind feels along your skin and how your body feels, and really go through that process. And I found that directly is aimed at helping with this internal training load to help calm people down, relax them. But if you're one of the types of people who really, really struggle to have a day off and have a recovery day or go through active recovery, like framing it in that way, that's, look, we're working on this particular element of mindfulness, I found that to be pretty effective, and it's something that I've been really enjoying doing at the moment myself.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And as I don't want to say an exercise addict, but I enjoy exercise, and I just love movement and being outdoors. And so I'm one of those people that struggles sometimes with taking that day off. And so that reframing and giving yourself an active activity that addresses some of those things is just beautiful. I really like that.
Yeah, nice. And I'm sure a lot of people resonate with exactly what you said there. It's tough to take a day off sometimes, but hopefully some people will get a bit of insight from that. So
Yes.
let's dive into, there's always going to be a situation where, say, a hiker or a trekker is leading up into a relatively significant adventure. And there's always the temptation in that situation when you have a particular deadline, and you're rolling into your training sessions, you're like, you know what, like, even if I'm feeling tired, I want to push through. And sometimes when you push through these types of workouts, like, and you're feeling not great, you can have an amazing workout once you get through the initial stuff. But on the other hand, sometimes it goes the other way and you're like, oh, you know what, that I feel worse now, I feel terrible, and that sets you back for a few days, or in the worst case scenario for a week or so. Like, how can you gauge when powering through is the right answer versus, listening to that internal load and those internal feelings and potentially decreasing the training session or reducing the intensity or even having a day off?
Right. You're absolutely right. There's just some days when your heart's not in it, but if you're dedicated and you've got goals, you're going to power through and do the work. And I'm really all for that, as long as you're reaching your training outcomes. So it all comes back to training outcomes. It all comes back to, what are your goals, and are you moving in a positive way towards those goals? And if you're familiar with dollar cost averaging, it's an investment tool, but it's a bit like that, and it's something that I've used with athletes as well. You can use that same formula to monitor your training. So that means you can have a few bad days. You look at investments, you see those graph charts for investments a lot of times, and they'll have some dips. They'll have quite a few dips oftentimes, but the overall trend is that it's moving upward. And the same thing with your training. You can have a few bad days, and that's fine, as long as you're trending positively towards those goals. But then the caution here is that if you use this approach for more than a few days, you increase your risk of injury, because you're placing an overall training load on your body beyond what your tissues have the capacity to handle. Therefore, then it's better to dial that back for a day or two and address the internal load than to move forward and power through and hurt yourself. And really, the only way you know that is if you're keeping track, and if you're monitoring that internal load more than just, gosh, was Tuesday a good workout or a bad workout? I don't remember. I think it was okay. Boy, it feels terrible today, but tomorrow's good. You can be all over the place if you try to remember it. But if you can just track it, then that will help you decide, you know what, I've had good training days for the last week. Today is just an off day. Okay, I'm going to power through today. But if you look back and you think, I had 4 days last week, which were just terrible, and today just feels terrible, then it's a red flag that says, hey, let's take a minute, let's take a time out, and let's slow down, and let's look at your internal load variables and see what needs to be tweaked. And to that end, as I mentioned earlier, I have developed an internal load tracking sheet for your listeners. So I know your clients are used to spreadsheets. I love how you use spreadsheets. So this is a spreadsheet to help them keep track of their internal load with each training session. It's really simple. It's only 6 questions, and you get a numerical answer from 1 to 5. And these questions I've taken from a validated measure of internal training load used by sports scientists. But I've really simplified this scale to be used by anyone. And then that way they can track it. It's just a simple spreadsheet you can have on your phone or on your desktop and fill out, and then you can look back and see what that internal training load has been like for you, and if you have any red flags. And your listeners can sign up and receive this for free on my website at www.thehealthyhiker.com/load.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
what I'll do is I'll drop that link in the show notes below for anyone to have a listen. Before we wrap up, because I think that'll be super valuable for a lot of people. Before we wrap up, do you just want to talk a little bit more about the Healthy Hiker and what you actually do with hikers?
Sure. I know that you are getting more and more elite as you deal with even people who are mountaineering, and that's fascinating to me. But I really deal with people who maybe are starting out on their trek, or have had some trekking experience in the past but want to resume it. Maybe they're getting back into it. Maybe they've got some past health issues or past injuries that they're worried about. So I put them through what's called a Base to Summit program. And that means you can start out anywhere along that continuum from the base to the summit. And we evaluate your goals. It's an individually tailored program. As you were saying, that cookie cutter programs are not always going to get the training outcomes because they just don't take things like internal load into consideration. So I work one-on-one with all of my clients and help them get strong and achieve their goals so that they can conquer their dream hike.
Amazing, amazing. And from all the stuff that I've seen you putting out, and every time you come in on here, like I absolutely love your approach to everything and the way you share so much quality information, and it's just so applicable to the everyday hiker. So I highly recommend anyone who's listening to check her out, to check out the Healthy Hiker, and definitely get your hands on that internal load sheet, because I know I will be.
Good. Well, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure, Rowan, and I just so appreciate all that you do for the trekking community and the good information that you put out as well. I find it very useful in my own training.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been another fantastic episode, and I think a lot of people are going to get some really good insights off this. So thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure.